Conscious Leadership Podcast, the human side of leadership, where consciousness meets practical business leadership. The podcast dives into real challenges managers face, from team motivation to navigating change. Discover actionable insight, proven strategies, and inspiring stories to help you lead with clarity, authenticity, and impact. Whether you are an SME owner, a team leader, or simply passionate about conscious leadership, this podcast will equip you with the tools to build stronger teams, foster trust, and achieve sustainable success. Tune in, lead consciously, and make a difference. Hello, and welcome everyone to a new episode of the Conscious Leadership Podcast. I'm your host, Boris Nedved. Today I want to talk about conscious leadership and the future of organizational development. And I'm really delighted that I have a guest today in our podcast. Welcome, Katrina de Angelis.
Thank you,
Katrina,
Boris. Yeah, so good to be here.
welcome. Katrina is a co-founder of the Milo Human Care and a board member of the Conscious Capitalism in LA. And she worked before in large corporates, and she brings in her tremendous experience in these large corporations, especially in organization development departments. So again, welcome, Katrina. And may I give the word to introduce yourself to the listeners?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, so as you mentioned, my journey kind of came from corporate, and it's funny because it was non-traditional in a way that I didn't do the traditional go to school, get a corporate job, work, 7 to 9 p.m. and all that stuff, because I quickly realized through working in team building when I was in university that so much was needed from an organizational development perspective. And at the time I was calling it therapy for the workplace, because I would see all these corporate teams come in and kind of complain and talk about all of the toxicity happening at the workplace. And of course, nothing is going to happen or change when you come to have some beers and have fun for the day, and then you go back and things stay the same. So me being a therapist-minded young individual, I was like, well, I need to go into culture development, organizational development, and that sort of sprung me in that direction straight out of university. And from there, I worked with a lot of different big companies. I spent a lot of time working with Johnson & Johnson for 3.5 years on their end-to-end leadership program for high potential talent, as well as some of their other programs within the organizational development space. And then, Keurig Dr. Pepper. And then I kind of transitioned to like smaller companies. So it's really interesting. I've seen across the board, I would say, from large corporate to really small teams. And there's just different nuances that I think show up within all of those systems and structures, right? And some are more rigid than others. But it's been an enlightening journey. And I think actually over the years, I've slowly gotten working with smaller and smaller teams because of the impact that I can see and have versus what really needs to happen for the larger companies and a more systemic evolution, I think, which I'm sure we'll get into.
I mean, look, dear listeners, you see that, Katrina has definitely a decent background in all of these topics. And I want to challenge her and see her a little bit as well, what she has observed in the business landscape. And in particular, I've noticed in the last couple of years, the buzzwords and the language like authenticity, alignment, and purpose are really entering the boardrooms and the business talks and so on. But I seriously wonder myself, do businesses really mean that? Or is this just PR and packaging? And with that maybe surrounding, ask you, Katrina, what have you observed? What have you seen as noticeable shifts in the last 10 years in the business world when it comes to organization development?
Yeah, absolutely. I think, it's for a while we've been seeing these buzzwords, authenticity, purpose, like you mentioned, and there's, greenwashing, regenerative washing, what is clean even? What are all these things? They sometimes feel like words. And And oftentimes, they are. It's really a both and. And to me, it comes down to intentionality and where and how it's actually being used. So often what happens is there can be good intentions behind wanting to bring in more purpose or more authenticity, but without actually changing the structural system that is holding the organization together, it ends up being more performative or still still within the rigid structure,
Mhm.
but just talking about a different thing. So it's still very much focused on those mechanistics of the organization versus truly making the culture a living, breathing, and adaptive thing. And oftentimes you run into issues where, let's say a company is saying, oh, okay, I want my team to make more values aligned decisions in the organization so that we don't have to be so hierarchical. But then what happens is you still have the same KPIs that you had before you made that decision. And so the leaders are not incentivized to make values based decisions. They're still incentivized to make profit based decisions. And so when you just change the intention of the system, but not the actual structure or system itself, you're going to get not only the same outcomes, but actually a complete misalignment of now what you're saying versus what you're doing. And that creates a lot of tension even for leaders within the organizations. There's been so many times that I have helped companies and teams develop leadership programs that truly are holistic of what people in the organization are saying that they need and what's going to support getting to an outcome. And then they'll scrap it all and just do like the easiest thing that gets the most impact right away, but not necessarily long term because they're trying to meet their KPIs. So everyone is thinking very short term, even if they want to try and do the long term thing, it doesn't actually end up getting incentivized. So I think that does create like a disconnect between what companies are saying and what they're doing. And that doesn't mean that that's true for all organizations. I often think the bigger the organization, the harder it is going to be to make those actual structural and system changes. And it seems to be a little bit easier with medium to small companies. But I think now what has happened, it's because, the big companies are the ones that get all the headlines and, they get all the attention and all of this. And so when you've built a system on fundamentally extractive or exploitative systems, it's putting band-aids on it, right? You truly
Mhm.
need to compost it, break it down into something new. And it doesn't mean necessarily blowing it all up, but it does mean surrendering and releasing things that are not in alignment with that new vision or that new purpose and values and really essence of the company.
It's a great point that you mentioned the changing structure, the changing organization. I was recently in contact with Basetis, which is an
Hmm.
IT service provisioning company in Spain, and they actually got rid of their CEO as a structural element, as a position in the org chart. And
Wow.
they have now a five-team leadership team of 5 team members. And it was funny because when they reached out to clients and suddenly the client side CEO wanted to talk to the Basetis CEO, they had to say, look, we don't have a CEO. And the other side, the client side, was then saying, yeah, but how can't you have a CEO? So this kind of
Hmm.
traditional structural thinking, a company needs a CEO, cannot have just a leadership team composed of multiple people. That is so much in the heads of people still. And
Hmm.
that is possibly as well a question I want to ask you. Have you seen as well how companies apply still the old frameworks, the old assessment tools, the old assessment models to actually new world problems? And isn't that where Einstein's famous quote of why do we treat the problems that we created with the solution or with the tools still with the same tools? So have you seen that
Hmm.
as well?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, even just building off of what I mentioned earlier about the system and the
Mm.
rigidity, but then kind of putting the band-aid on it, that's exactly what happens. And so there's there's a quote that I'm thinking of. as well that goes perfectly with what you had just shared. It'll come to me. But really, the language is evolving, like we said, right? But the incentives and infrastructure are still remaining extractive. And so even though there's a consciousness shift potentially, and it's still not familiar, and we tend to avoid or reject what is unfamiliar. So that's why you also see, even if people might have a consciousness shift and then they come across a team who doesn't have a CEO, it's like, how could you do that? Because it's unfamiliar. And
Mm.
so we have to be willing to go into uncharted territory and not just inherit those outdated systems. We have to really begin to compost them into new mental models. So it actually goes beyond that system to, first and foremost, changing our awareness around something and the mental models that actually told us that we have to do it a certain way because we've internalized these inherited and outdated systems. And so, some examples of that is we measure we don't measure impact, right? We measure profit. So there's a lot of companies now trying to measure impact so that they can incorporate that into their actual foundation structure to incentivize the right things, as well as seeking clarity and essence in what's wanting to be expressed versus control. So control is a very, again, traditional method of leadership. And that is the traditional like CEO, hierarchical. Whereas when you have a team that's actually working as that living organism, making decisions and, changing things and, whatever that is, it's actually, you're going to get a lot more creativity. You're going to get a lot more outcomes, impact, and all of it because you're not limiting yourself to the consciousness or the evolution or the mindset of one person.
Mhm.
So we actually learn and grow in that chaos and messiness. And so people often think like it would be so messy or disorganized, but actually we need that in order to reorganize. And that's what has to happen. And I think we may have talked a little bit about this part before of like, do things need to blow up to come back together? But it's really actually they need to be willing to be in the confusion, in the questions, and in the seeking clarity in what wants to be expressed by this organization and tapping into essence to get that clarity versus having it be so rigid and control oriented and then people don't even want to be creative or share their insights and all of that. So creating the systems and structures to allow that to take place is also really important. I think you asked me something else too, like what is outdated
Yeah,
versus yeah.
it's it's actually you mentioned a couple of points that possibly I want to like jump on now. One side was consciousness, the other side the structure. And I mean, I've worked long enough in a large corporate, and what I still observe, and that is still the rules, is like the financial accounting rules that anything you do with people, with employees, is always cost. There is no
Hmm.
kind of incentives of handling it differently. There's nothing that shows investment really into people, into training them up, into skilling them up, into utilizing the intrinsic strengths of people to really build a company that is new and different. So I think this is for me as well an element that organizationally and structurally that would have to change. On the other
Yeah,
side,
absolutely.
I'm currently writing a next book, which is around decentralized autonomous organizations, which is possibly what you mentioned as well. These small entities, these small quote departments, these small groups that
Hmm.
like rattle the organizational setup. Um, Yet I'm still kind of thinking as well how to govern it because
Hmm.
for me that there needs to be, I wouldn't call it control, but a level of governance around it that it actually can work. And I always
Hmm.
think of small farmers, like one family farmer and the next one family farmer and so on. And there are three, four farmers that work together. They have possibly their own one shop together, and it's all biological, and they have a huge success. But
Yeah.
possibly they produce more products, fruits, vegetables, whatever it might be, than they actually could sell via their shop on their local like home markets. They would need then possibly something, a logistics department that would like transport the surplus to warehouses, distribute it further, and things like that. Um,
Hmm.
so for me, it's the combination of smaller structures with still larger structures that just offer the scale, so to say. What do you think of that?
Yeah. No, absolutely. I completely agree. And I think there's two things happening right now, right? There's these big organizations that were built on systems of fear, rigidity, competition, growth at all costs, extraction, exploitation, and consciousness can't thrive in those systems, right? So consciousness can only evolve the system as much as the system is going and willing to allow it to evolve that system, right? So if you don't open up those pathways and think of new ways to redesign it, it's just the energy is going to be stuck. And so what you're saying is a great example of, you know, based on everything that we know and based on what is needed in the world, how do we design businesses that are just fundamentally different? So, like, my recommendation to a bigger company would probably be very different than it would be to new organizations that are in the development phase, because it's it's going to be very hard to completely transform those big companies, right? So I think it's more important for these newer organizational structures to start emerging and, in a way, reclaiming market share, and becoming more relevant to build new systems. And so, an example of that is even our company, Milo. That's very much how I'm thinking about the organization that we're building. It's how can we create how can we create a system that empowers different local communities, that enhances the overall economy locally, and then also still has global impact in ways, but creating these like mycelium networks of, okay, great, you have like this group of farmers here who already grow this ingredient. Like, how can we actually set them and optimize them up for success? And then those ingredients go to somewhere else who is now we're empowering another community
Yeah.
to support the production of those ingredients. So it's like, how can we, instead of having like a vertical or supply chain, actually have it be horizontal and have greater impact in the communities based on the things that we need, and then localize that to different hubs and repeat that system all over the world, so that personal care, which is a human need, can actually be something that contributes to economic thriving. And it's completely different way of thinking and building. But when you start from the beginning with the mindsets that you just shared of how do we, be more decentralized, how do we, share the economic impact and growth, and how do we support more communities in the process, is, these are the important questions I think to ask.
Yeah. Now you mentioned again that the word consciousness. I mean, my podcast is called Conscious Leadership, and
Hmm.
I occupy myself a lot with consciousness, what it means, and well, quantum physics and things like that. Now, for me, a conscious leader is somebody that starts to understand him or herself first. How do you see that? And do you see that it is actually happening? Is there really an increased level of consciousness in what you see in organizations, in leaders, in managers, in owners? I mean, you definitely, what you described now about Milo with your company, you go a different way. You are a very conscious person and you consider all of these things. Do you see that this is happening in businesses as well?
I definitely see a shift towards developing self-awareness and consciousness in that sense within organizations. I still think it's very maybe like two-dimensional or three-dimensional, where it's, how can we become more self-aware and systems aware?
Hmm.
I think the challenge become like the bottleneck becomes that the structures, vision, and even accountability are not necessarily tied to that. So, there's some leadership practices that I think are just completely obsolete at this point, which is the leading through pressure, fear,
Mm.
one person being like the individual hero of it all, treating leadership as a personality trait, like being authoritative, or even visionary, and rigidity and pointing fingers, and sort of like all of this fear, blame, pressure, which naturally has sort of arose from the way that we structure organization. But there's still some more traditional that are still valuable. So you ask, consciousness, how it impacts the organization, and do I see that shift? And yes, I see it in individual leaders. I think we get stuck at these parts. So we get stuck at the structure, the
Mm.
vision, and accountability. So structures need to, traditionally they're more linear. Like, organizations have structure. The problem is that the structure is not adaptive. It's not living. It's not like breathing. It's not developing consciousness in and of itself. It's still restricted. And then vision, you see vision a lot, but it's often very ego driven, growth driven, rather than essence driven, which is going to be more. This is now tapping into consciousness, and as it relates to the consciousness of the organization, like what truly needs to be expressed through this organization right now. What does the world need? What do the people need? What is our role in it? And so it's going beyond individual self-awareness, and then really becoming systems aware and being accountable, not just to avoid punishment, but accountable to the relational coherence of the entire system. So it's also awareness of the space in between you and I, the space in between our team, and that consciousness that is co-created. So, traditionally we look at organizations as rigid and machines. And so we need to evolve the consciousness aspect beyond just individual awareness and into systemic and relational coherence and awareness. And so, you mentioned the role of a leader in conscious leadership, and I love what you had said. If you want to repeat it, actually, I'm going to add something to it, because I feel like this will develop even our own definitions of it.
Yeah. I mean, for me, yeah, as I said, a conscious leader is for me a leader that knows himself, that knows
Mm-hmm.
what strengths, what is inside, what is intrinsic, what is a natural skill set. And I wanted actually to add, because that was just a thought I had today, and kind of working as well on a new article, which is for me the leaders and what they are bombarded with, or call it managers, call it middle managers, whatever it is. They are bombarded constantly with new stuff. They have to manage the budget, manage the teams, manage the questions, manage the clients, get more
Yeah.
revenue, and they all need to learn as well new leadership models constantly, which is something always like from external. Like now it's agile, the next
Mm-hmm.
time it's I don't know, traditional, the next time it's freelance, whatever might the
Mm-hmm.
model might be called, and it's going faster and faster and faster. And when do they actually have time to internalize it, to kind of empower it into them to live their own true self? And then this other buzzword, authenticity, that we mentioned before, is that then authentic if it's learned? Is it really intrinsically grown? I don't think so. And possibly that's
Mm-hmm.
just another layer of around consciousness for you to play with now.
Yeah, no, totally. And I think, like, what I would share to even extend and evolve that is the conscious leadership role is to be self-aware and understand themselves, and then to become a regenerative leader. It's not to drive the outcomes, but it's to tend to the field and the capacity of the system itself so that things can unfold. So now you're going from, okay, my role is to be more self-aware, and then with that awareness, what happens next? Well, what happens next when you move to a truly regenerative perspective? I think this is the more multidimensional, energetic system where you're tapping into now what is myself in relation to my team, the system, the organization. And it's not like, pushing these outcomes, but it's really like tapping into that entire field of existence so that things can unfold, and nurturing the system's capacity, the organization, the team, the capacity of the system, not managing people, but actually truly nurturing that entire energetic system. So, you know, you need that intuition, that consciousness, that understanding of yourself to even be able to think about or go
Yeah.
into that mindset, because to understand yourself is then to understand another, and then to understand another is to understand the space in between, because we project so much, right? We project what our leadership is onto others. We assume people think the same, and that's just a human, you know, tendency, which takes actual work and awareness to undo and recognize that not everyone is the same, not everyone even has the same needs.
Mm.
And so to be able to sense into that entire field and nurture the essence of yourself and then of somebody else, and then also everyone's essence in relation to now the team or the organization. And so actually even moving beyond purpose to essence and being emergent. So one really big thing about conscious and regenerative leadership in organizations, I think, that is often missed is this emergence. Right now, it's, again, still very rigid. The systems don't necessarily support evolution. It's contained to very specific KPIs, visions of the future. It's not through listening, seeing what is emerging, seeing what's truly needed, learning from the interconnectedness and or the interdependencies of the system and the people themselves, but rather it's still very directive, which
Yeah.
limits a lot of the creativity and opportunity to evolve.
That concludes the first part of my interview with Katrina de Angelis. I hope you enjoyed it so far, and I wish that you tune in for the second part of the interview. So thanks again for tuning in. Until the next time, stay intentional, stay conscious, and keep leading with purpose from the inside out. Thank you for listening to the Conscious Leadership Podcast. Look forward to the next episode to come, and stay intentional, stay conscious, and keep leading with purpose. Until the next time, bye.